Imagine being 200,000 miles away from home, floating in the darkness of space, when suddenly, boom, a massive explosion shakes your spacecraft. Lights flicker, systems fail. Your oxygen is leaking into space, and you realize you may not make it back alive. That's not the opening scene of a Hollywood movie. That's exactly what happened to the astronauts of Apollo 13 in April of 1970. And what makes this story even more incredible is that it has gone down in history as NASA's so-called successful failure. How does a near disaster become a success? And how did three men trapped in a dying spacecraft, along with the brilliant minds on the ground in Houston, manage to pull off what many thought was impossible? That's the story we're diving into today. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. So welcome, my friend. Grab a comfy seat, maybe even a snack, because this isn't just some dusty history lesson. This is a real-life survival thriller, except it actually happened. And the people who lived it didn't have the luxury of rewinding the tape or calling cut. Their lives depended on quick thinking, teamwork, and a whole lot of creativity under pressure. And along the way, we'll hear not just about the astronauts inside Apollo 13, Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert, but also about the unsung heroes on the ground at Mission Control who refused to give up. Because, honestly, their story is our story too. It's about facing setbacks, mistakes, and curveballs life throws at us, and somehow finding a way through. Now, before we jump into the drama of alarms blaring and oxygen tanks blowing up, let's take a step back. The Apollo program itself was already one of the boldest human adventures ever attempted. Just think about it. In the 1960s, when most people's computers were the size of a room, NASA was trying to land people on the moon. Apollo 11 had already pulled it off in 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history with one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The world cheered. America was riding high. And Apollo 12 followed soon after, proving the first landing wasn't just a lucky shot. By the time Apollo 13 rolled around, you might think the excitement had cooled a bit. In fact, many people saw it as almost routine. Imagine that flying to the moon had already started to feel normal. But here's the funny thing about life, and about space exploration in particular. The moment you start thinking something is routine, that's when it can knock you off your feet. Apollo 13 was supposed to be just another trip to the moon, another flag in the ground, another rock collection to bring home. But instead, it turned into one of the most dramatic stories of human survival ever told. And it all started with three men climbing into a spacecraft that was both advanced and fragile at the same time. The commander of Apollo 13 was Jim Lovell. This wasn't his first rodeo. He was a veteran astronaut, steady, calm, and respected by everyone. His crewmate, Fred Haise, was the Lunar Module pilot, the guy who was supposed to actually walk on the moon with him. And then, just 2 days before launch, Jack Swigert was brought in as command module pilot because the original pilot, Ken Mattingly, had been exposed to the measles. Talk about last-minute changes, right? Can you imagine being swapped in at the 11th hour for one of the most dangerous missions on Earth, or rather off Earth? Jack Swigert had to step into that role without missing a beat. Now let's pause for a second. Imagine yourself in their shoes. You've trained for years, you've studied every button and switch inside the spacecraft, you've practiced emergencies in simulators. But in the back of your mind, you know this: space doesn't care how well prepared you are. It's hostile. It's unforgiving. One tiny mistake, one small piece of equipment failing, could mean the end. And yet, these astronauts strapped themselves to the top of a giant rocket anyway. Why? Because that's what explorers do. They push forward, even when the risks are enormous. So, on April 11th, 1970, the Saturn V rocket roared to life at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Flames shot out. The ground shook, and Apollo 13 thundered into the sky. Families of the astronauts watched nervously. Mission Control in Houston monitored every heartbeat and every dial. And the world barely looked up. Because remember, by now, people were almost used to the idea of rockets going to the moon. It's kind of wild to think about, isn't it? For the first couple of days, everything seemed smooth. The crew even did a live TV broadcast from space, showing off their spacecraft, cracking little jokes, and sending greetings back home. But here's the twist: hardly anyone on Earth was watching. Ratings were low. People were busy with their everyday lives. Nobody realized that the very next day, Apollo 13 would become front-page news for all the wrong reasons. It was April 13th. Yep, you heard that right. Apollo 13 ran into trouble on the 13th of the month. Talk about unlucky numbers. The spacecraft had just passed the halfway point to the moon when Mission Control asked Jack Swigert to stir the oxygen tanks. This was a routine procedure, just mixing up the liquid oxygen so sensors could get an accurate reading. Swigert flipped the switch, just like he was trained to, and then chaos. There was a loud bang. The entire spacecraft shuddered. Warning lights lit up the control panels. The crew could hear a hissing sound like air rushing out. In Houston, alarms went off on the consoles. And Jim Lovell's calm voice came through the radio with one of the most famous lines in history. "Houston, we've had a problem." That sentence might sound calm, almost casual, but make no mistake, this was deadly serious. An oxygen tank had exploded. Not only did this mean the crew was losing the oxygen they needed to breathe, but it also knocked out electrical power. The command module, the main spacecraft designed to bring them safely home, was suddenly crippled. Imagine being in the middle of the ocean, and your boat springs a massive leak, and your engine dies, all at the same time. That's what it was like for Apollo 13, except instead of an ocean, it was the vacuum of space. Mission Control quickly realized the severity of the situation. Flight Director Kranz and his team of engineers and controllers now faced the ultimate challenge. How do you get 3 astronauts back to Earth alive when their ship is falling apart? And remember, this wasn't something you could Google or call tech support for. They had to solve it themselves, with the clock ticking and lives on the line. Inside the spacecraft, the astronauts had to shut down the command module to save what little power was left. That meant they would have to use the Lunar Module, the part that was supposed to land on the moon as a kind of lifeboat. The Lunar Module, called Aquarius, wasn't designed to keep 3 men alive for the journey back to Earth. It was meant for 2 men to live in for about 2 days. Now it had to support 3 men for 4 days. You can already see the problem. But here's where things get fascinating. When everything seemed hopeless, both the crew and Mission Control refused to give up. They started thinking outside the box, literally. How do you fit a square peg into a round hole? That became a real question they had to solve, and we'll get into that in a bit. But for now, just imagine the tension. The world finally tuned in. TV networks were broadcasting constant updates. Families of the astronauts sat by the phone, waiting. People across the globe prayed, hoping for a miracle. And yet, despite the fear, there was also this strange sense of unity. Engineers who normally never left their desks were pulling all-nighters. NASA's brightest minds were scribbling on chalkboards, testing ideas, simulating failures, and trying to invent solutions on the fly. It was like a massive puzzle, except the pieces were scattered, some were missing, and the clock was ticking louder with each passing hour. The astronauts, for their part, had to conserve every bit of energy. They turned down the spacecraft's temperature to save power, so it got freezing cold inside. They had barely enough water to drink. Every breath of oxygen was precious. Can you picture it? Floating in the silence of space, shivering, thirsty, exhausted, and yet forcing yourself to stay calm because panicking would waste oxygen and brain power. By this point, Apollo 13 was no longer a moon mission. It had become a fight for survival. And the question everyone was asking was simple: would they make it back alive? And that's exactly where we'll pick up in part 2. Because if you think things were tough already, wait until you hear about the carbon dioxide crisis, the improvised repairs, and the razor-thin calculations that determined whether these men would live or die. So there they were, 3 astronauts drifting through space in a damaged ship, freezing cold, running low on power, and now facing yet another terrifying problem. It wasn't just the lack of oxygen for breathing anymore. Something else was building up inside the spacecraft. Something invisible, odorless, but just as deadly: carbon dioxide. See, every time you exhale, your body gets rid of carbon dioxide, or CO. Normally, spacecraft have filters to clean it out of the air so astronauts don't breathe it back in. But on Apollo 13, the Lunar Module's filters weren't designed for 3 men, only 2. They were quickly clogging up. Levels of carbon dioxide started creeping higher. Imagine being in a tiny freezing room, unable to open a window, and slowly realizing the air is becoming poisonous. That's exactly what was happening. Now, here's where the story takes one of its most famous turns. The astronauts had perfectly good CO filters in the command module, but the command module was basically shut down to save power. They couldn't just swap them in because the filters were different shapes. The ones in the lunar module were round. The ones in the command module were square. It's like trying to plug the wrong charger into your phone. Doesn't fit, doesn't work. And yet, they had to find a way to make it work because their lives depended on it. So what did NASA's engineers do back in Houston? They gathered all the gear the astronauts had on board. Plastic bags, cardboard covers from manuals, tape, socks, hoses, whatever they could find. And then they literally built a makeshift adapter to connect the square filters to the round system. One engineer later described it as building a device to put a square peg in a round hole. That phrase became legendary. They tested their design on the ground, gave instructions to the astronauts step by step, and with a little teamwork, Apollo 13's crew built the strange-looking contraption in space. It looked ridiculous, like something out of a kid's craft project, but guess what? It worked. The CO levels dropped. The astronauts could breathe easier. Think about that for a second. The line between life and death wasn't high-tech computers or shiny machines. It was duct tape and teamwork. It was people thinking creatively under pressure. Isn't that kind of inspiring? How many times in life do we think we need the perfect solution when sometimes the scrappy, simple, homemade solution is the one that saves the day? But even with CO under control, the challenges weren't over. Not by a long shot. The crew still had to figure out how to get home. The lunar module didn't have the navigation systems the command module had. And remember, the command module was shut down like a car with the key turned off. That meant the astronauts had to come up with a way to steer their spacecraft without the usual tools. Imagine trying to drive home with your headlights off, your GPS dead, and your steering wheel barely working. That's basically what Apollo 13 faced. So Mission Control came up with a plan. They'd use the moon's gravity as a slingshot to curve the spacecraft back toward Earth. But to make that work, the astronauts had to perform engine burns-controlled firings of their spacecrafts. Engine at precisely the right times and angles. Too much thrust, and they'd skip past Earth into deep space. Too little, and they'd burn up in the atmosphere. And the kicker: the lunar module's engine wasn't meant for these kinds of burns. It wasn't built for precision, yet it was all they had. Picture this. The astronauts are crammed into the freezing lunar module. Their breath is fogging in the air. They're exhausted. And now they have to fire the engine while manually keeping the spacecraft on course. But how do you steer in space when your navigation system is down? Here's the clever trick. Jim Lovell looked out the window and used Earth itself as a reference point. By keeping Earth in the crosshairs of their tiny guidance device, they managed to keep the ship pointed in the right direction. Can you imagine the nerves of steel it took to trust your eyes instead of your instruments with your life on the line? When the engine fired, everyone on Earth held their breath. Seconds ticked by. And when the burn was complete, Mission Control confirmed it had worked. The spacecraft was on a path home. Cheers erupted in Houston. But still, they weren't safe yet. The ship had only barely enough power and water left to last the trip. Every ounce mattered. They had to ration water so tightly that each astronaut got less than a cup a day. They were so dehydrated that when they finally got back, they could barely stand. And the temperature? Inside the lunar module, it dropped close to freezing. The men wore every piece of clothing they had, rubbed their hands together, and kept moving just to stay warm. Haise, in fact, got so cold and dehydrated that he developed a kidney infection during the mission. Just surviving those last days was brutal. Meanwhile, on Earth, the whole world was glued to the story. News stations ran constant updates. Families prayed. Even people who had never cared about the space program before suddenly felt connected to these three men fighting for their lives in space. It was no longer just an American story, it was a human story. Russians, Europeans, Asians, Africans, millions of people followed along, united in hope. Isn't it amazing how in times of crisis, borders and rivalries can suddenly fade into the background? But as Apollo 13 approached Earth, a new fear crept in. The command module, the only part of the spacecraft designed to survive re-entry, had been shut down for days. Nobody was sure if its systems would even restart. If the batteries had drained too much, or if something had been damaged in the explosion, the astronauts could burn up in the atmosphere or skip off into space forever. Imagine the tension of that moment. After days of fighting for survival, it might all come down to whether the command module would wake back up like a sleeping giant or stay dead. Mission Control worked out a painstaking procedure for the astronauts to bring the command module back online, step by step, without wasting a single drop of precious power. They rehearsed it dozens of times on the ground, making sure it was foolproof. Finally, the astronauts followed the plan. Switch by switch, system by system, the command module lit up again. It worked. But would it hold long enough? The final hurdle was re-entry itself. As the spacecraft hit Earth's atmosphere, there would be a blackout period, a stretch of several minutes where radio signals couldn't get through. Normally, it lasted about 3 minutes. But with Apollo 13's heat shield possibly damaged by the explosion, nobody knew what to expect. Would the ship survive the fiery plunge through the atmosphere? Would the blackout last longer? Would the crew even be alive when communication returned? When re-entry began, the world went silent. People everywhere stared at their TVs. Mission Control was quiet, eyes glued to the consoles. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. Still nothing. 4 minutes. Still silence. The longest blackout in history. And then, finally faint crackling voices from the spacecraft. Apollo 13 had made it through. The parachutes deployed. And then, on April 17, 1970, the command module splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts were alive. The room in Houston erupted. Cheers, tears, hugs. Around the world, people celebrated. Apollo 13 had not landed on the moon. It hadn't achieved its original mission at all. But it became one of NASA's greatest triumphs. Because, against all odds, they brought the crew home. That's why it's called a successful failure. They failed to reach the moon, but they succeeded in saving lives and proving that human ingenuity can overcome even the most impossible challenges. Now, you might think that's the end of the story, but in many ways, the aftermath is just as fascinating and inspiring. Because Apollo 13 didn't just change NASA, it changed the way people thought about problem solving, leadership, and teamwork. And in part 3, we're going to dig into that legacy. What lessons did Apollo 13 leave behind? How did it reshape space exploration? And more importantly, what can you and I learn from it that applies to our own everyday struggles? Stick around, because if you thought this story was already incredible, wait until you hear the wisdom that came out of it. When Apollo 13's command module splashed down into the Pacific Ocean and the astronauts were lifted safely onto the rescue ship, the world let out a collective sigh of relief. Think about it. Just days earlier, many had assumed they wouldn't survive. And now here they were, cold, weak, exhausted, but alive. It felt like a miracle. But beyond the celebration, something deeper lingered. The mission had failed in its original goal, yet it became one of NASA's greatest triumphs. And that's why we call it a successful failure. But what does that really mean? And why should it matter to us today, decades later? Let's zoom out for a second. Apollo 13 showed us something powerful. Success isn't always about reaching your original target. Sometimes success is about surviving the storm, adapting to setbacks, and finding a new path forward. The astronauts didn't get to walk on the moon, but their survival became an even bigger achievement because of what it revealed about human determination and ingenuity. Doesn't that sound like real life too? How often do our own plans go sideways? You plan for the perfect job, or the perfect relationship, or the perfect project, and then, boom, something explodes in your life. Maybe not literally, but you know the feeling. Suddenly, you're forced to improvise. And maybe, just like Apollo 13, you discover strengths and solutions you didn't even know you had. One of the most famous figures from the mission, Flight Director Kranz, summed it up in a phrase that became legendary: "Failure is not an option." That wasn't just a Hollywood line from the movie, it captured the mindset that drove his team. They couldn't quit. They couldn't throw up their hands. Lives were on the line, and the only path forward was to keep solving problems until the astronauts were safe. Can you imagine what would happen if we applied that kind of mindset to our own challenges? The mission also highlighted the power of teamwork. Those astronauts weren't alone. Behind them was an army of engineers, scientists, and problem solvers working day and night. And here's the thing, none of them got famous. You probably can't name more than a couple of people in mission control, yet their creativity and persistence were just as heroic as the astronauts floating in space. It's a reminder that behind every big success story, there are always unsung heroes, the teachers, the mentors, the teammates, the friends, people who help us get through our own crises. And let's not forget the duct tape. Yes, the duct tape. Out of all the high-tech gear that went into Apollo 13, one of the things that saved the mission was an everyday roll of tape. Isn't that wild? It shows us that sometimes the tools we need are simpler than we think. The real magic isn't in the tool itself, it's in how we use it. That's a lesson we can all carry. When you're stuck, don't overlook the simple, scrappy solutions. Creativity often beats perfection. Now, let's think about the legacy. Apollo 13 reshaped how NASA approached missions. It forced them to pay even closer attention to safety, redundancy, and contingency planning. Later, Apollo missions were safer because of the lessons learned. But the influence didn't stop there. The story of Apollo 13 has been taught in business schools, leadership seminars, and classrooms around the world. Why? Because it's not just a space story, it's a human story. It teaches resilience, problem solving, leadership under pressure, and the importance of keeping calm when everything seems to be falling apart. And I want you to picture this. Somewhere out there right now, someone is going through their own Apollo 13 moment. Maybe it's a business on the edge of collapse. Maybe it's a student who feels like they're failing. Maybe it's someone dealing with personal struggles nobody else can see. For them, the lesson of Apollo 13 is clear. Setbacks aren't the end. They're the start of a new kind of success. A successful failure doesn't mean giving up, it means finding victory in survival, in persistence, in refusing to quit. Jim Lovell, the commander, later said something profound about the mission. He said, "We never lost the moon. We gained the Earth." What he meant was, yes, they didn't achieve the goal of walking on the moon, but they achieved something greater. They showed the value of human life, the strength of teamwork, and the spirit of exploration that can carry us through any crisis. And that's worth more than a pile of moon rocks, don't you think? There's also a personal side to this story that I think we often overlook. Those astronauts weren't just astronauts. They were husbands, fathers, friends. Their families were watching from home, glued to every update, wondering if they'd ever see their loved ones again. In mission control, many of those engineers were just regular folks, young, sleep-deprived, under enormous pressure, who could have cracked. But they didn't. They held it together, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. That's the part of Apollo 13 that really hits home for me. It wasn't just about saving astronauts. It was about people showing up for each other when it mattered most. And maybe that's the real lesson. Space exploration is cool. Rockets are awesome. The moon is amazing. But at the heart of Apollo 13 was something much more down to earth. People helping people. People refusing to give up on each other. Isn't that the kind of spirit we all need a little more of today? Now, before we wrap this up, let me ask you this. What's your own Apollo 13? What challenge are you facing right now that feels overwhelming, maybe even impossible? And what if you approached it the way NASA did, with teamwork, creativity, persistence, and the mindset that failure is not an option? Maybe you don't need a rocket or mission control. Maybe you just need a little duct tape, a little courage, and a little support from the people around you. Apollo the 13th of May have happened more than 50 years ago, but its message is timeless. Life doesn't always go according to plan. In fact, sometimes it goes spectacularly wrong. But those moments don't have to define us by failure. They can define us by how we respond. And when we keep going, when we stay calm, when we refuse to quit, we often find that our greatest triumphs are born from our hardest challenges. So as we close out this story, let's remember the courage of Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert. Let's remember the brilliance of Kranz and the mission control team. Let's remember the power of human determination in the face of impossible odds. And let's take a little piece of that spirit into our own lives, because who knows? One day, your own successful failure might be the story that inspires someone else. If you enjoyed this journey through one of NASA's most dramatic missions, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me what part of Apollo 13's story inspired you the most. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories from space and history that remind us what humans are truly capable of. And remember, failure is not the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of your greatest success.